Hello, welcome to this Q&A series about the thesis by publication. Today I'm going to be talking to you about formatting your thesis. It's probably not something that you're going to think about until right at the end when you're putting everything together, but that is a stressful time and you don't want to be meeting some unexpected challenges. So I'm going to outline some of the challenges that candidates have faced or may face in formatting their thesis by publication. Okay, so if we have a look at this example of what a thesis by publication might look like, this is just one idea, but what we most probably have are some chapters that include papers. But we also have some sections that do not, and we may have some extra information also within a chapter. For example, some information here with some prefacing information that couldn't fit into the paper itself. So what you're going to have are two types, I guess, of text. Your papers and what I'll just call your thesis text. So everything that is not a paper. So there are basically two ways that you can look at how to format your thesis. And the first is just to insert the papers as they were published. You may be allowed to have some amendments, but generally you put the paper in as it was published. You might get a nice typeset PDF document. The other way is to take the content of the paper and to insert it into your document and match the formatting to the rest of your thesis. Generally, there are not strict guidelines about what to do, and you may do a little bit of both. So these are some of the things that are going to be, I guess, there will be some inconsistencies across the different publications and between your publications and your thesis, the text of your thesis. So you'll probably see different font size, different font styles, different columns, different spelling conventions. You may have submitted to a US journal and a UK journal, and they have different required spelling conventions, and of course the different referencing styles. Now, to have different, this type of formatting differences is not a really huge problem. You may like to explain why at the beginning of your thesis when you're explaining what the thesis by publication is and how it is different, especially for examiners who are not familiar with the model. And another idea is to delineate your papers from the chapters in an explicit and obvious way so that there's a kind of not a random jump from one to the other, and we can get ready for the changes that we're going to see. So in the theses that we have analyzed, we've seen page borders that are just on the papers, or often we see a footer of each paper that will say paper 1 and maybe with a title. So it's very clear when the papers are changing from one to another and when you're changing from a paper to the thesis text. Now, perhaps a little bit more problematic are these issues, the numbering. So every paper is going to have page numbers that are not going to be coinciding with the page numbers of your thesis. That also is the case for header numbers. If your particular journal has numbering for their headers and subheaders, and then table numbers and figure numbers. So what you really want to make sure is that there is consistency throughout the thesis as a whole, because the examiners are looking at the thesis as a whole and they're going to want to look, for example, at table 5 and be able to jump fairly quickly to table 5 without having to jump which paper is it and where is it. So we really, at this stage, want to think about how accessible the information is and how easy it is to jump from one section to another. If you do heavily reformat a paper, and this is something that a lot of people do for consistency and for readability, you might also want to include a copy of the published version in an appendix. Okay, next. The other thing, there are some elements of papers that generally aren't included in a thesis, so things like abstracts or keywords or author biographies. You can decide whether you keep those in or out. And it's not a big problem, but probably just something you want to think about. And referencing may be something that's quite a challenge, because you're going to have references from each paper, and you're also going to have references from the thesis text, which may be in different chapters, or maybe prefacing papers within a chapter. And as I said before, there's going to be different referencing systems, and you also may be referencing multiple sources that become inconsistent across the different texts. So, for example, Smith might be someone very important in your field, and you've cited them 2017A, 2017B in this paper, but in another paper you've only cited this 2017B, but of course it's not 2017B anymore, it's just 2017. So trying to reconciling the different sources to make sure that it is very clear which document you're referring to in all cases. There are basically 4 ways that we see different candidates trying to consolidate, I guess, the different reference lists that they have in their thesis by publication. The first is, and it will depend on the structure of your thesis, but one very common method is to have a reference list at the end of each chapter. So each chapter is its own little contained document that has its own reference list at the end. Another option is to have all the references only once at the end of the document. Another option is to keep the reference lists for each paper, and especially if you're using the PDF file as is, you might want to keep, well, it might be impossible to remove them, to keep the reference lists in each paper, and then at the end of the document to have a reference list that includes all of the other references, the references from the thesis text. And a final option that we have seen is to, again, keeping the reference lists connected to each paper, but also to include at the end of the document a list that includes those papers again, but also includes all of the references from the entire text. And you may be required, as was my case, to regardless of the approach that you take, to have a consolidated reference list at the end where all of your reference lists are in one space, making it easier to try to find the different sources. But again, that's going to cause some headaches if you're having a consolidated reference list. In this case, it would be recommended that you're using a single referencing format. So there's going to be some changes to be made there. So these are some of the challenges that you might face when formatting your thesis document. If you don't have specific guidelines, what you might like to do is to have a look at what other people in your field have been doing, other people in your department and institution. But otherwise, what I would suggest is that you give your thesis to someone who maybe has never seen it before and ask them to find a particular table or to find a particular paper, and just see how easy that is for them to do. Because the most important thing when we're formatting our thesis would be that it's readable and accessible to our examiners and to our future readers. So I hope that's helpful. You can check out the paper too, which gives some of these issues a little bit more discussion with some examples as well that you can take a look at. So thank you very much and see you next time.